Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. It's good to have you back here for this lectionary Bible study for February 7th, 2021, the fifth Sunday after the Epiphany. Today we're going to be looking at three texts, one from Isaiah chapter 40, one from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and then one from Mark chapter 1. There isn't necessarily a cohesive theme between all three of them. If I was to kind of be forced to make a sentence that would tie all three together, I see a theme of God's work is for all people. And so it's sort of, as I've said before, the Epiphany season has a strong emphasis on mission activity, both in Christ's and Paul's work in the Corinthians. And the Old Testament lessons sort of focus on this, that the gospel is for all people, for the Gentiles, for the outsider, for the unclean. And so that sort of theme just keeps coming up again and again, as is this theme of Epiphany is very much missional in that aspect. And so we're going to see in Isaiah chapter 40, we're going to see themes of God being creator of the heavens and the earth, and that his work is for the people of Israel as well as all of creation. We're going to see Paul talking about caring for the weak brother and being in service to him. And then we're going to see Jesus in Mark chapter 1, not only healing and proclaiming, but needing to go to the next town and the next town after that, so that more people can hear and to know that the reign of God is coming close. So those are the themes for this week. Some of you might be wondering, and maybe you care, maybe you don't care. If you don't care, then, fast forward the next 3 or 4 minutes. But I had said last week that I was probably preaching on the 1 Corinthians passage, then I ended up preaching on the Mark passage for those who watch both the lectionary Bible study and the sermon on Sunday the 31st. And one of the things I wanted to sort of explain is, why might on Monday I think one thing and then Sunday something else happens, and sort of let you into the process of preparing a sermon and what that looks like in my mind. And so, why did I not preach on 1 Corinthians and why did I preach on Mark? And one of the key things that happened as I began to meditate on the text and think about its application was that many of the applications that I was making, I had made 2 weeks prior. And so for 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the themes and applications of chapter 6 and chapter 8 felt too close together that I had talked about caring for your neighbor and having Christian freedom to serve your neighbor, and replacing neighbor with weaker brother, though accurate and important, felt like hearing the same thing too close together. And that's one of the things I found as someone who likes to preach through books. In Kansas, I preach through a lot of different books. So usually I do an Old Testament book in the winter, and I do a New Testament book in the summer. And so I'd usually do some sort of minor prophet, and I'd do some epistle. And what I ended up discovering every time I did this was the shorter letters. If I did a sermon series on 1 John, John makes the same point 4 or 5 times in his epistle. And so even though you're reading different texts, each week, the same thing keeps popping up. And so it becomes repetitive, and people start to tune out repetitive things. And so that's a little bit of how that sort of plays itself out, is when I get past the initial text research, which is kind of what this Bible study is, you then have to start thinking about applications and how do you apply it to your audience and to your people, and are they hearing the full counsel of God, is sort of the rule of thumb here, which is why one, we have the lectionary so that we see large swaths of Scripture with different points of application throughout the year. And why, and this is something that pastors with a little experience learn as they go through, is that you don't have to include everything you know in every sermon that you preach. And so if you were to look at some of my earlier sermons in 2013, 2014, 2015, what you'll find is me trying to jam everything that I learned about the text into the sermon. And so it becomes muddied and you sort of lose track of the point. And once you realize that, A, you're going to be preaching to people for more than this one time or this one moment, that you have time to express the fullness of the texts over a long period. You have to do it all at once. It sort of frees you as a preacher to be willing to say, okay, though this is important, this doesn't need to be said today. It can be held off for another date. So anyway, that's kind of, what happens between Monday when I do this video, and today's Tuesday, and Sunday when I preach a sermon. It's one of those, that's one of the things that kind of gets sorted out during the week is, what's the application? When was the last time I said this to the people? And do they need to hear it again? And so that's the sort of the thing that I considered. Now, why did I preach on Mark and the word of authority? I thought that sermon had a far greater gospel emphasis, that we as people know that when God speaks, his words mean what he says. And so when he says we're forgiven, we truly are. And that felt like something that needed to be said, more so than to love the weaker brother. So anyway, nobody was here for that sermon. It was just me and the camera again, which I'm starting to get used to when it does have to happen. But anyway, that was a little tangent to get going. I don't know if I'm going to have any tangents on the text, so we got that out of the way. And now we can go ahead and look at Isaiah chapter 40. If you're wondering what text I do plan to preach on today, Tuesday, I am thinking it's going to be the Corinthians text, because this is going to be a slightly different focus than what has been going on in the past couple weeks. But again, I reserve the right to change my mind. So all right, here is Isaiah chapter 40, verses 21 to 31. Now, if you recall, Isaiah chapter 40 is a big deal kind of chapter, and it's somewhat of a hinge chapter in that, I'm trying this camera angle, and one of the things that happens in Isaiah is that at chapter 40 we transition from sort of the historical narrative that is 1 through 39, and then we go to 40 to 55, and then 56 to 66. And so chapter 40 serves as this hinge into part 2 of the book. And so we see a lot of themes that are going to be expressed throughout the next 15 chapters, and we are seeing some different themes and ideas carry through. And so even though we don't read 1 through 20 here, that should be somewhat in our mind. And if you recall, so 40 verse 1 and 2 is the comfort my people text. And so that sort of is in the background here. And so we have sort of this Advent, it's often read during Advent and Christmas times, this promise of a servant, a promise of God stepping in and saving his people. And so that's what we're going to see a little bit of that in this morning's, or this week's text. Okay. Why were you really close to my face in that camera? Because I'm trying to have two cameras, one that's centered when I'm at the table and one when I'm closer to the desk camera, the one that does with the paperwork, so I can switch back and forth. If you really don't like me being that close, someone should tell me. Otherwise, I might keep doing it. But it also feels like you're really close to my face and you see a lot of my forehead. But we'll work on that maybe. All right, to the text. Isaiah 40, 21 to 31. Do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows on them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Okay, so this text has a couple different parts, and because the text was a little bit longer, I had to zoom in a little bit, but it makes it a little harder to see the whole thing here. But basically, we have a transition at the end of verse 26. So we have a part 1 and a part 2, part 1 up here, part 2 down here. And how do we know it's a different sort of part? We have this repetition in verse 28, have you not known, have you not heard, that we also see in verse 21. And this verse 28, this repetition that we find in verse 28, is precipitated by verse 27 and the question that's being asked by God to the people. Why are you saying this about me? And so this is God's response to a degree, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Looking at the beginning section of this text, that's big and bold. Some things of note: the foundations of the earth is a concept, it's an Old Testament concept. And one of the things while reading on this text is that the cosmology of the ancient world does not fit well with the cosmology of the modern world. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the ancient Israelite people and the ancient civilizations did not see the world and creation as Earth as part of a solar system, as part of a larger galaxy, as part of a larger universe in which things are ever expanding, and there are stars with their own planets and galaxies. And we sort of see our world through the solar system charts and understand our place in the universe sort of idea in relation to grander and maybe even greater galaxy systems and the like. And the fact that we even think about entities outside of our field of view is something new to the modern world. While the ancient world sees, I'm not saying not sort of a flat earth sort of idea here, because that's not what Scripture's teaching, but more of a picture in which sort of, I guess you could say, and this is going to be terrible, you have a house which is built upon foundations. And around that house then is a canopy or a tent. And that canopy or curtain is the heavens. So, you have stars. All around the heavens, and above the heavens then sits God. And at some point, God is going to tear open the curtain and come down through the curtain, through the heavens, and inhabit the earth and take action. And so it's just the way of seeing the world that is, of course, foreign to us, because we deal with the sort of scientific model of the galaxies, and we have had Copernicus tell us how the things are, and so we sort of see the heavens differently than the ancient world does, which is fine, on both counts. There's nothing wrong with seeing well, I was going to say there's really nothing wrong with seeing the Earth as the center of the universe, except, it's not the center of the universe. And the sun doesn't go around it, obviously. But seeing the heavenly realm as a curtain that hides God is fine. It's not like I can tell God and the Holy Spirit how they should see the world. It's perfectly fine to sort of recognize this curtain that separates us from God, which is an image that is picked up throughout. So we have that phrase, veil of tears, and seeing through a veil dimly, that we are seeing God. We're trying to see God through this curtain. And so we have also the curtain of the temple, which then represents the same idea, that there needs to be a curtain between us and God, so that we are protected from his majesty and might, and that we can't approach him in his holiness, which we do see this idea being picked up in verse 25, where we see Isaiah call God the Holy One, in contrast to his unholy creation. And so there needs to be this curtain between us and God. So that's part of this, what's going on here. So when we have this image, it's he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. Anybody who's flown on an airplane sort of gets that idea, how small people look, how small cars look from above. God, from his vantage point, sees human activity like grasshoppers, which just reminds me of Texas, because the grasshoppers there are crazy during the summer nights. They're just everywhere. I don't have that sort of issue in Indiana as much. So then, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain? So there's that curtain idea that I was talking about, and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. And so we sort of have this tent over us. And when we have the proper picture of God's relationship to us and his creation, so when we have this proper picture of how far God is removed and how big he is and how small we are, we can then deal with the idea of princes and kings and rulers and how little importance they actually have. For he brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. And so it sort of just points out that politics is temporary, and kingdoms are temporary, and everything else around us is temporary when compared to the grandness and greatness of God. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he, that is God, blows on them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. So here we have this picture of the lastingness of governments and empires. And why is this point being made? The answer is these words are for the Babylonian captives. These prophecies of Isaiah 40 are meant to be read by those who have been exiled into Babylon and now have to deal with King Nebuchadnezzar and Belteshazzar and those who come after them before Cyrus, which we would see in chapter 41. We'd see Cyrus being named as a servant of God, rescuing and serving God's people. So lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. He who brings out the host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. What host? Probably the heavenly host. How great is the heavenly host? They're quite mighty, but God still knows all of his angels by name because of his great might and strong power. So those are that's sort of that first part, pointing out the temporalness of government and the grandness of God over all creation. Then we get to part 2, and this section is dealing with another question, which is, again, keeping in context the Babylonian captivity. My way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God. And then we go back to the have you not known, have you not heard? Do you not know who God is sort of the question, and God's going to be revealing his nature then to them, both in this section and in what follows in 40 to 55. And so this verse is sort of getting to, this section is dealing with the why. Why are the people of God suffering again? Why have they found themselves in captivity? Why have they found themselves in exile? Is it because God has disregarded us? Is it because God is now hiding himself from us? Have we sinned so much that God no longer cares for us? Or did the Babylonians really defeat God and not just us? Because the temple was destroyed and the people were lost their homeland. So maybe it was God who was defeated and not just the Israelites. And so God is sort of putting things back into perspective here. The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. And so that is another declaration of who God is, his nature, his power, his might, and his being over all things. And then we sort of shift into God's actions. What does he do with this power and might? And there we see 29, 30, and 31. And these are verses, so if I was to preach on this text, heavy emphasis would be on 29, 30, and 31. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This is just a great promise for those who are sick, feeble, frail, fragile, suffering in their flesh, I suppose might be the best way to put it. Those who are lacking in strength, and that is many of us, especially those we find in the hospital rooms and shut into their homes. And here we have this promise of that he gives power to the faint, and that he who has no might, he increases strength. And God does not get exhausted. God does not get tired. Even young men get tired and get exhausted and get weary. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength and shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And so we as Christians, we as those who believe in God and trust in him, have our strength renewed through our faith. And so seeing our faith renewed and the strength that comes along with it, strength for another day, strength for another week, strength to continue to fight the fight, and to wrestle with temptation again and again. We find as we go to the foot of the cross and see Christ and his sacrifice and are reminded of the hope of the resurrection and the glory that awaits, we are able to have our strength renewed and to see see the purpose of our struggle, which is going to tie in a little bit with 1 Corinthians chapter 9, as he talks about not boxing against the air, but training ourselves for the work that God has given to us. We continue to do that. So we renew our strength through the Word, and by so doing, we continue to run and not grow faint. Okay, so that's Isaiah 40, 21 to 31. And what we find here is, we see the two-part text, and they're tied together by recognizing who God is and his power and might, and that he's above all these sort of earthly temporal things, that he's in control, that he has, that he's watching over things, and that when compared to him, our big struggles are still small, and that as we continue to put our trust in him and recognize who he is to us, that we can have our strength renewed in our struggles and in our griefs and in the things that we deal with. So those are all good ideas to keep in mind, and I'll probably tie in a little bit of that with 1 Corinthians if I do that for Sunday. Looking then at 1 Corinthians, since we just mentioned it. Now I gotta mess with the Zoom because the papers look different because of the different way the text is printed. Okay, so here's 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 16 to 27. If I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but not of my own will. I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as to not make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners compete, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Okay. So there's a couple different things going on here, and there's probably three sections to this text. And the first section is Paul talking about the need to preach the gospel. The second is sort of how he's going to preach the gospel and how he's willing to be flexible with his preaching. And the third is sort of an application of the Christian life and the discipline required to do the task given by God. And so there's sort of three different sections there. And one of the things that sticks out to me, and this is somewhat tying into the first tangent of the video, is when Paul says, he can't help but preach the gospel. And I can relate to that, in that if I don't preach for 2 weeks, it feels like forever. So I think in the last 2 years, I've taken 2 weeks off in November before the whole Christmas season and Advent season starts and gets going. And so I'll take 2 weeks off in November. And by the time I get back, it just feels like I haven't been in the pulpit forever. And that there's this need, this urge to get back in the pulpit and to proclaim the gospel. And I get why, if you've met retired pastors or spoken to them, there's a lot of them who will preach until they die in the pulpit. They'll preach vacancy work, and they'll do all sorts of interim pastor work because they need to be in the pulpit. They need to preach the gospel, and that there's just this drive of the Holy Spirit to proclaim it and to speak it to people. And so that's, a pastor ought to feel this way, and sometimes needs a vacation so that they can continue to feel that way. That feeling does get lost over time as everyone sort of gets burned out in their own jobs and their own work. Pastors burn out all the time too. And so when you get that 2 to 3 weeks off of preaching, that urge, that passion really does start to come back, and you start to miss the proclamation of the gospel. So that was one of the things I saw that always resonates with me in this passage, is just that need to, that if I don't preach the gospel, I don't know what to do with myself on Sunday mornings. And it's one of those things where it somewhat drives you. And I do my best not to be a giant jerk in somebody else's Sunday school class on a vacation Sunday. So if I go to church somewhere else, I try not to use that as a platform to tell them everything that I know, and sort of take over the class, which is profoundly rude to do. But some guys are really good at just trying to take over the class because they have to tell you about the gospel, and if this is the opportunity, then they're going to take it and go with it. And so that's just one of those things that I think about with that text. Now, how does that relate to you? Because you aren't the preacher. You aren't the one called to the task of public proclamation. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a desire to both hear the word of God proclaimed. There should be that. That's sort of a third commandment sort of idea, the desire to hear the word of God and to grow in it. But there should be this desire to speak about it, that it's something that's important, that you speak with your spouse or a friend, or you come to Bible class because you want to talk about this thing that you've been thinking about in this way, that God's word has sort of enlightened you to his gifts and whatnot. And so there should be this desire to speak about God and to come into his presence and to hear, not only to hear the word, but to speak it to others around them. And so that's probably how I would sort of look at that first part. I'm not probably preaching that because it's hard for me to disassociate that text from my own task, and I don't like preaching about preaching in the pulpit. You can do that at like the seminary when you're talking to preachers and how they should care about their preaching, but telling a bunch of lay members about how preaching is great and everyone should love it doesn't go well, because maybe everyone doesn't love your preaching. Not that anybody watching this video doesn't love my preaching, because I know it's just the best ever. So anyway, that's this is woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. That's the sort of idea here that I'm looking at, and I read from Paul, and I get it. It just sort of feels like you need to be doing it if you're not doing it. So then going into 19, we see this. We've seen this passage before. I have become. I'm gonna move over my highlighter. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Now, this passage has been taken out of context a lot, especially through, you have your church consultants, which will tell you how to change everything about your church, and then you're going to get 100 new people if you just follow these 15 steps and, throw out everything that makes you a church. But there's also this mindset that if we just became a little bit more like X or a little bit more like Y, then we would get the people who like X and Y, and therefore we would have more people in the pews. And so it goes something like this. Pastor, if we would just appeal more to the young people, there'd be more young people in the church, and we just need to change, our hymnody and our music, and we'd be far more successful, and we'd have a lot more people in church. And that might be true. I don't know. It usually isn't. And what ends up happening is you don't appeal to the young people because the young people see through your inauthenticity, because you don't really want to be doing this sort of music or this style of service, but you were told to do it or told that it would work. And then the people who have been in church for their whole lives and grew up with one thing all leave for another church that isn't messing with their liturgy. And so you end up with less than what you started with. And then you get a lot of frustration, a lot of arguing, and a lot of infighting, which is just what people wanted. So that's the sort of way in which you abuse this passage. How do you use this passage properly? Well, how is Paul becoming all things to all people? Well, he's talking about Jews, Gentiles, and the weak. And last week's text had the weak brother who, Paul's willing not to eat meat anymore if that means that he can save the soul of a weak brother. If we had it's one of those questions, if you had a vegetarian come and try and join your church and said, I really love the Lutheran message, but I have a hard time about the way people eat and consume meat without care or thought to the treatment of God's creation and his animals. I think I would love to join this church and be a Christian if you could just, stop eating meat and, eggs at breakfast or something. Would we as a congregation be willing to give up our rights to those things for the sake of the soul of one? Is that what you're willing to do? Or so it's more of an issue of sacrifice than it is an issue of change. So it's not as if Paul has to just. It's not as if Paul is becoming different people, that he's putting on different faces. What he's doing is he's being willing to sacrifice things that he recognizes aren't necessarily of utmost importance. It's not as if Paul didn't know how to be a Jew. Paul knew how to be a Jew. He was a Jew. He was zealous for Judaism. He knew all the laws. He knew what it meant to be under the law. And though he wasn't putting himself back under the law, he could interact as one who understood the rules. In the same way, he could interact as one who understood not following those rules, being a Gentile. And he also knew what it meant to be weak and fragile in the faith, because he had to learn and he had to grow, and his faith was, in a sense, a sapling. And so it's not as if he's willing to change and put on a fake face to appeal to a certain demographic. He is willing to set aside the things that he knows, to tie into last week's text, and to do so for the service of others who aren't prepared and don't know how to do this yet. And that's something that he says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. That's his goal. He's just trying to allow the gospel to take hold and to be preached and proclaimed, and that he's willing to do whatever is necessary for that gospel message to grow in the hearts and lives of those around him. Then we have part 3 here at 24 through 27, and this is the part I also relate to because, I used to be a runner, and I say used to because, that was 50 pounds ago. And so I have been the runner who has competed in races and ran, and it required a great deal of self-control over the body to be successful. And all I got was a ribbon that I put in a box and put in a closet. And so I was willing to do it for, this ribbon that was never blue. Um, but it's perishable. And yet, what self-control do we have over our bodies for that which is imperishable, for the sake of the heavenly crown, the heavenly glory that we will receive in life everlasting? Are we willing to discipline ourselves, lest we be found disqualified? And that's, thinking about self-discipline is one of those things where it's a lot easier to say than to do, and we know that, right? So we know that knowing the right course of action and doing that course of action are far different things. I know what it would take for me to be 50 pounds lighter and to be able to run marathons. I've been there and done that. I know the training regimen. I know the discipline that it takes. I know the eating schedule, and calorie intakes, and all those sort of things. I know what that looks like. Yet here I am, unable to run a 100-yard dash without being completely gassed. So knowing what to do and being disciplined enough to do it are pretty far apart when thinking about life. And so it's just as much the case, and this is why Paul uses this metaphor, is it's one thing to know what the Christian life ought to look like. And it's one thing to know what a Christian ought to be doing with their lives and how they ought to be doing it. And it's another thing to be actively disciplining oneself to do and to work as God has called us to do and to work. And that self-discipline carries itself into all sorts of different facets. And in some ways, I think about this self-discipline and this training and why so many churches have been declining and failing and falling apart. And it's the same reason why if I tried to run a race right now, I would fail and fall apart and die. And that is because I am not trained for that work. And when we look at the state of the church in the 21st century, especially, taking our own church body at the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, where did we find success at? And where do we find when were our growing periods? And we look at it, and our growing periods were, in most recently, the baby boom of the 50s and 60s, and then their children, and seeing that in the 90s and the 2000s. And then before that, the German immigration and the European immigration into America. And this is where we sort of see the success of many local churches, especially in urban areas, where immigrant populations would go find a community in which people spoke the language and were part of the culture, and then they'd find the local church that also spoke the language and was part of the culture, and those churches then grew out of that. And we see that in places like Whiting with the Slovak church, that the Slovaks gathered together, spoke the same language, formed a church in their community, and that church thrived in a Slovak community. But as the communities changed and demographics changed, and community and the way people gathered together wasn't by ethnic group anymore, things started to slowly fall apart. And it was because of this, it's in my opinion that because of this basically 100 years of general success without much work, as in people just came. Why did the German Lutheran Church grow in Bremen, Indiana? Well, because German immigrants kept coming for 50 years and kept settling there, and the church began to grow. And then there was World War II and the baby boom, and then all the families had lots of kids, and they all stayed in church and they all stayed in town. And then in the late 90s to early 2000s, the baby boomer kids were all there, and everything was going great. And then after this, we sort of see this big decline, and it's because things are harder now. It's going to take real work, real self-discipline. In the same way, if we're going to carry on this metaphor a little bit and belabor this point a little bit more, I didn't have to worry about what I ate when I was 17 and my metabolism was so fast that I could eat whatever I wanted and still, not gain any weight. That's how I see the church now is, in a sense, and between 1900 and 2000, our metabolism was fast and we could be thin without much effort. But we have started to now get into our 20s and 30s, and if we eat junk food, we are going to get fat and slow. And this is what has happened to our American churches, is that we have been lulled into fat slowness and are not prepared for the work at hand, the manual labor required to gain a harvest, to mix metaphors some more. And so these words of Paul should speak harshly to our hearts and to our congregations, because we have not been training. We have not been exercising self-discipline, not only in our own lives as individuals, but as communities who are tasked to preach the gospel, that we have not disciplined ourselves to be trained in proclamation, to be trained to speak what God wants us to speak to our neighbors and to those around us. And so this is just one of these, it's 3 verses, but I think it really speaks to some of the problems we're facing as a 21st century church, and why we're facing those problems is that we have gotten flabby in our self-discipline. Not just, you could apply that to lots of different realms, but especially in our Great Commission work. And so this is one of the reasons why, I've thought about this in terms of how do we get mission as to be part of this church here at Trinity. And the goal is to start slow, to commit ourselves to the effort, and then to slowly work ourselves into fitness. Because you can't just say, I want to run a 5K and then get up off the couch and run a 5K. You'll be dead. And so, or you'll be quite sore and can't move for the next week. And so in the same way, I can't just say, and I know I did, let's baptize 20 people this year. That's sort of like saying, let's run a marathon. But the same sort of idea, though, if you don't have that goal in mind, you'll never start disciplining yourself to work toward that goal. If you never say, I want to run the Chicago Marathon, you'll never get up off the couch and start running. And so the idea of having our goal in mind and being disciplined to then achieve that goal. All right, well, I feel like I've spent a lot of time and maybe spoiled a little bit of my sermon thoughts, but that's the way it goes. So let's finish up and look at Mark chapter 1 and go from there. Okay. Mark chapter 1, 29 to 39. Immediately Jesus left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said to him, Everyone is looking for you. And he said to them, Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out. And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. Okay, so there's 3 sections, as you can see. There are three little paragraph breakdowns here. First, we have the instance with Jesus and Peter's mother-in-law. So Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and they told Jesus about her, and he came, took her by the hand, lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. So here is a healing miracle. Why does Jesus heal Simon's mother? Well, because Jesus was tired of waiting for his cup of coffee. No, that's not. That's a joke. But he healed his disciples' mother-in-law because she desired. It could be because she desired to serve them. She desired to be. She knew who she was in the presence of. It's not like Simon and Andrew didn't tell their Simon's mother-in-law about this Jesus whom they had met and who they're following. Maybe she desired to be a disciple and to serve Christ in his mission. And so, Jesus brings healing to her so that she can do what she desires, which is to serve Christ in his work. And then we see sort of 32 and 33 and 34. When evening comes at sundown, people start bringing the sick and the oppressed, and the whole city. So that's an important phrase here. The whole city was gathered together at the door. So there's a crowd now, and it's more than just Jesus and his 4 disciples and Jesus and his disciples' families. This is the entire town has come to see Jesus. Now, why at sundown? Maybe because they all got off of work. So the sun came down. Everybody started hearing what had happened, and they started bringing out all the people who were sick and all the people who had needs, and they brought them to Jesus. And then again, we also see, continuing on from last week's text, he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. So that's an interesting concept. And then we see this transition to Jesus leaves in the morning, he departs, and he prays. We'll talk about that in just a second. Then Simon goes out and tries to find him. He finds them. Everyone is looking for you. This everyone is not hyperbolic. When we see that the whole city was gathered together at the door, it is everyone in town is looking for Jesus. And he said to them, "Let's go on to the next towns. We're gonna leave here, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." So here Jesus identifies his why statement. He has come out to preach and proclaim to people. And so there we see he goes out through all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. So that's a quick rundown. Let's take a couple more parts here and dive in a little bit. What we see here is we see a continuation of the theme from the last text, which is the reign of God versus the reign of Satan. And so we see this conflict. So this is part of the divine conflict going on in Mark's gospel. And why are we dealing so much with oppressed people by demons? Why is that playing a center stage here in this last part of Mark chapter 1? What does it matter that they have a guy with an unclean spirit? So why, we don't live in a world where we talk about people being oppressed by demons, and why does Mark care so much? And that is because he is setting up this contrast between the reign of Satan and the reign of God. And what we find in the reign of Satan is it's a reign of brokenness, sin, rebellion, and judgment. While we find in the reign of God healing, forgiveness, worship, and reconciliation. And that's my attempt at making up a list and then giving you opposites of that list. And so the reign of God brings these things, and the reign of Satan brings these things, and these are in conflict at in a sense, a cosmic level. And so part of that is the fighting between the servants of Satan and the servants of God. And Christ is then, he's conquering these things and those who are trapped under this reign of Satan. And when we think about reign as kingly rule, and that, we think about, if you think back to the temptation of Christ, and Satan's willing to hand over the reign of the world to Jesus if he were just to bow down. Satan does have a reign. He does have control over things, and he has control over those who are broken and those who are in rebellion against God. And he brings sin and judgment into the world. So that's part of what's going on here, is we're seeing this conflict continue. And why? So in this last verse, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. Why is this casting out demons part important? Because he's going to win this fight. And part of proclaiming the good news is proclaiming an end to this reign, that the kingly rule of brokenness, sin, and rebellion is coming to an end. And instead, God will be ruling, and his ways of healing, forgiveness, and worship and reconciliation is going to be what governs the day, and is what God will see through his vessels and his workers. So there's that going on. One of the other interesting things about this text is that in Mark, there are only 3 instances of prayer by Jesus. And so this is one of them, in which, so he goes out to pray, and the question is, what did he pray about? Why is he praying? Why did he need time to step away and to speak with his Father? And the general assumption, the answer that I liked from the commentaries is that Jesus was praying about whether or not to leave. Does he allow his fame to grow from Galilee, from Capernaum, and have people come to him? So are they going to, is he going to set up shop? Let's say this is Sea of Galilee. Capernaum's over here. I don't know if this isn't accurate. It's not to scale. Does he want this to have people come to Galilee? So he sets up shop and people come to him, like John the Baptist, for example, who's at, here's the Jordan River, and John the Baptist sets up shop, and he expects people from Jerusalem and all the surrounding area to come to him, because this is what he's doing. He's baptizing here and proclaiming a message. So is this the kind of ministry that Jesus is to have, one of attraction and sort of a gravitational pull, or is Jesus going to go from town to town to town to town to town, and create a reputation throughout all of Galilee and Judea? And so that may be what he's praying about. What tactic is he going to take as the one who's proclaiming and preaching? He wants to proclaim the reign of heaven. Where does he have to go? What should he be doing? What course of action should he take? And we ultimately see him take this course of action. Now, one thing to ponder is, what's the advantage and disadvantage between these two courses of action? And the advantage to Christ's course of action here, what he prays and decides to do, is that he reaches the poor and the weak, and not the wealthy. So, and why would I say that? It's pretty simple. I'm trying to phrase this correctly. Sometimes you hear the joke, why can people protest on, why are people protesting at 10 o'clock in the morning down the street? Well, they don't have jobs, you know. So you can do all sorts of things if you don't have a job to go to. And so, those without jobs are free to move about and to see things and to go on vacations. And, those who are independently wealthy can go see stuff. But those who are poor, those who are low in society, don't have the freedom of mobility. And so that concept, we still see in today's life, why. So for example, why do the poor in Chicago not move to a place with better job opportunities? For example, Southwest Kansas had all sorts of jobs available. Oil fields were always hiring good workers. Why couldn't, there was plenty of jobs in Kansas, and why wouldn't those in Chicago who were suffering under high rent and low wages just move to Southwest Kansas or move to some place in Kansas and take those jobs? Well, it takes money to move. It's one of the things that's kind of a struggle when you're in your 20s. Like when I was in my 20s and we moved something like 6 times in 4 years, it's hard to move. It's hard to get up and go to another city. It's not a cheap thing to do, and you've got to save up. And when you don't have money to save for even little things, it's hard to save up for a moving truck. And so, it takes a certain amount of wealth to be mobile. And so if Christ stayed in Capernaum, the least of these, the people who are the lepers, the people who don't have social mobility or even geographical mobility, would never be able to encounter Christ. And so instead of staying in one place and never leaving it and letting people come to him, he is now going to go from town to town, reaching those who could never have gone and seen him if he were to set up shop somewhere and sort of be a show or be the center of some sort of town's fame. And so I think, in a sense, that does speak to the other 2 texts about, mission is for all people and for all creation. But also something we should think about as the church is that if the church never leaves its doors, there are advantages to attractional ministry, trying to be the most attractive place in town, but you're only going to attract those who can get there, and who can see it and who can change over and those sort of things. And so sometimes you have to leave and go and do the work outside the 4 walls sort of concept. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts, ideas with these texts, and things I wanted to say on those. And I've spent an hour now, so I feel like you've gotten all the thoughts that you probably want to get from me for this week. Like I said, probably preaching on 1 Corinthians text, probably going to be focusing a little bit on the self-training, self-discipline, training ourselves for the work God gives us, and then probably tying in a little bit of that Isaiah 40 passage about God renewing our strength, because exercise is exhausting and we need to have our strength renewed. And how do we find renewal in God and in the church and through his Son? So those passages are on my mind this week, and I hope they're on yours, and I hope you wrestle with them a little bit this week, and come back and worship with us and hear the sermon, and then come back next week and we'll do this all again. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.